On the morning of March 3, 1943, at approximately 10:15 hours in the turbulent waters of the Bismarck Sea, 30 nautical miles northwest of La, New Guinea, a single Japanese naval officer clung with a shaking, oil-blackened hand to the shattered wooden remains of what had once been the bridge structure of the destroyer Arashio, his uniform soaked with a suffocating mixture of fuel oil, seawater, and the debris of war as he struggled to comprehend the catastrophic devastation unfolding. Around him, images and sensations he would later recall as the most haunting moments of his life. Through eyes burning from salt, smoke, and exhaustion, he watched American B-25 Mitchell bombers sweep back over a debris field that stretched across miles of ocean, circling deliberately, methodically, almost clinically, above the burning slicks of fuel, the floating wreckage, and the thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors clinging desperately to shattered planks, overturned lifeboats, and any fragment of buoyant debris that might keep them alive. What had left Rabaul only 2 days earlier as a confident, tightly organized convoy, 8 transport ships carrying 6,900 elite troops of the Japanese Army's 51st Division, escorted by 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, had been reduced to an apocalypse of fire, oil, death, and rising terror. Yet even in this moment of horror, with hundreds already dead and thousands more floundering helplessly in the water, the survivors did not yet realize that their ordeal was only beginning, and that the hours to come would be far worse than the devastating air attacks that had brought their convoy to ruin. These troops, hardened veterans transferred from China, had boarded their transports at Simpson Harbor in Rabaul on February 28 with the firm belief that they were embarking on a mission that would reinforce La and decisively alter the course of the New Guinea campaign. Their commanders, including Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura of the 8th Area Army, had anticipated losses. Indeed, war games predicted 4 transports and dozens of aircraft would be sacrificed. But no one in the Japanese High Command imagined the magnitude of what would follow when Allied intelligence decrypted their plans and General George Kenney's 5th Air Force launched a meticulously prepared, revolutionary form of aerial assault centered on skip bombing tactics and heavily modified B-25 gunships capable of shredding ships at close range. Beginning on March 1, when a lone B-24 Liberator spotted the convoy rounding New Britain's northern coast, the Allies tracked every mile of its progress, and when 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked the next morning, sinking the Kyakusei Maru in an explosion so violent it was seen from every ship in the formation, it signaled not simply the beginning of an attack, but the opening act of one of the most decisive and brutal aerial ambushes in the entire Pacific War. On the morning of March 3, as the sea lay deceptively calm under a clearing sky, American and Australian aircraft descended upon the convoy with unprecedented coordination. High-altitude B-17s drew the Japanese fighters upward, while 13 Australian Beaufighters swept in at mast height to rake the decks with 20mm cannon fire, and behind them came the modified B-25s, approaching so close to the water that their propellers left trails on the waves, unleashing torrents of .50 caliber fire that silenced anti-aircraft guns moments before their bombs skipped across the surface like stones and smashed into the hulls of the transports. Ships such as Tio Maru, Shernai Maru, Taimei Maru, and Tio Maru broke apart, burned, or capsized within minutes. Admiral Kimura's flagship Shirayuki took a bomb directly into its forward magazine and vanished in a towering fireball. By 10:15 a.m., barely 15 minutes after the coordinated attack began, the convoy was effectively annihilated, and by noon, the Bismarck Sea had transformed into a hellish expanse of flame, floating corpses, wounded men screaming for help, and oil-choked survivors fighting to stay afloat. Roughly 3,000 men were now in the water, clinging to drifting wreckage as the surviving destroyers, Asagumo, Yukikes, Uranami, and Shikanami, attempted desperate rescue operations under constant threat of renewed attack. Although these destroyers managed to retrieve approximately 2,700 survivors and race them back toward Rabaul, their efforts were cut short when, at 1400 hours, American planes returned not to attack the surviving ships but to strafe the helpless men in the water. The Japanese survivors, initially relieved to see aircraft approaching, believing them to be conducting reconnaissance, were horrified when the planes dropped to wave height and opened fire with machine guns, sending up fountains of seawater, tearing through lifeboats, and killing wounded men who had barely survived the initial bombardment. For the next several hours, and then for several days afterward, Allied aircraft, B-25s, A-20 Havocs, Beaufighters, even P-38 Lightnings, made repeated strafing passes across the enormous field of human survivors, firing into rafts, swimming men, overturned lifeboats, and floating debris with what many historians later described as cold efficiency. General Kenny's order was unambiguous. No Japanese soldier was to reach New Guinea alive. The Americans justified this controversial decision as a matter of tactical necessity. Any soldier who reached shore would reinforce LA's defenses, but for the Japanese, steeped in Bushido ideology and expecting honorable behavior from victorious enemies, the methodical killing of helpless shipwreck survivors was a psychological shock so profound that many survivors later claimed it permanently altered their understanding of the war and of the enemy. Nightfall brought no relief. American PT boats entered the area, sweeping the water with searchlights and machine-gunning survivors who called out in the dark, while sharks, drawn by the blood and commotion, attacked wounded men who could no longer fight them off. On March 4th, as dawn revealed the full 40-mile stretch of carnage, Allied aircraft resumed strafing and even targeted rescue vessels such as the destroyer Arashio, which was sunk while attempting to retrieve more survivors. Over the next several days, American and Australian aircraft returned repeatedly to mop up survivors, as General Kenny later described it, ensuring that as few Japanese troops as possible would ever set foot on New Guinea. A confidential U.S. report dated March 20th chillingly noted that the slaughter continued until nightfall, and that any survivors who escaped strafing would be left in waters thickly infested with man-eating sharks. Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 braved the danger to rescue approximately 224 men in total, though crew members later described the unbearable torment of choosing whom to save among oil-slicked, half-dead survivors. By the time the killing finally ceased, only about 1,200 of the original 6,900 troops reached La, while a further 2,700 were returned to Rabaul by destroyers and submarines. Roughly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors had died, producing a casualty ratio of 230 to 1, one of the most lopsided losses in the history of naval warfare. In the aftermath, the battle forced a complete re-evaluation of Japanese strategy. Never again would Japan attempt to send a major convoy through waters dominated by Allied aircraft, effectively isolating its garrisons throughout New Guinea and condemning them to slow starvation, disease, and eventual annihilation. Survivors described the psychological trauma as irreversible. They had witnessed an American ruthlessness far beyond anything Japanese propaganda had prepared them for, and many concluded that surrender to the United States would mean torture or execution, contributing significantly to later patterns of suicidal resistance. For the Americans, the battle proved that land-based aircraft, properly armed, trained, and coordinated with intelligence intercepts, could destroy naval formations without the support of surface fleets or carriers, a revelation that reshaped Allied strategy for the remainder of the Pacific War. Historians continue to debate the legality and morality of the strafing of helpless survivors, noting that while the Japanese had themselves murdered American airmen in parachutes and committed atrocities across Asia, the Bismarck Sea represented a different, more clinical form of extermination driven by tactical calculation rather than cruelty. Yet the legacy of the battle endures not simply because of its strategic impact, but because of the moral questions it raises about total war, the blurred lines between necessity and atrocity, and the psychological wounds carried by those who lived through it. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of the most decisive, controversial, and transformative engagements of World War II, a moment when intelligence, technology, and air power combined to annihilate an entire convoy, when thousands died not in traditional combat but in the cold, deliberate slaughter of shipwrecked men. and when both sides confronted the brutal reality that modern warfare had evolved into something far more merciless than any doctrine, tradition, or code of honor had ever imagined.